The officer stopped his car at an intersection, but the situation got out of control when he allowed himself to hit Michelle Obama. Everything changed when her husband, Barack Obama, arrived on the scene. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching this video from. The streets of downtown Washington buzzed with life as the afternoon sun cast its golden light over the bustling city. Honks of impatient drivers echoed through the air, blending with the chatter of pedestrians and the distant hum of a nearby metro train. Vendors called out their wares from street corners, their voices competing with the cacophony of urban noise. It was a scene of controlled chaos where the rhythm of the city pulsed unabated. In the middle of this commotion, a sleek black SUV inched its way through the traffic. The tinted windows offered a cocoon of quiet inside, where former First Lady Michelle Obama sat in the back seat, scrolling through notes on her tablet. She had just wrapped up a meeting with the team behind her latest initiative, a project aimed at providing resources to underprivileged communities in the city. The meeting had been productive, but her mind lingered on the challenges ahead. How could they secure sustainable funding? How could they reach the people who needed help the most without bureaucratic delays? Her driver, a middle-aged man named David who had been with the family for years, glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "Everything all right, ma'am?" he asked. Michelle looked up and offered him a reassuring smile. "Just thinking about the next steps. We're making progress, but there's still so much to do." David nodded. "You'll get there. You always do." As the SUV approached a busy intersection, the traffic slowed to a crawl. A police checkpoint loomed ahead, manned by several officers in crisp uniforms. The makeshift barricade stretched across the street, forcing cars into a single lane. David frowned, tapping the steering wheel with his fingers. "Didn't hear anything about a checkpoint here today," he muttered. Michelle looked up from her tablet, her attention drawn to the scene ahead. "It's probably nothing," she said, though she felt a slight unease. Something about the checkpoint felt off. The officers seemed tense, their movements brisk and deliberate. One of them, a stocky man with a stern expression, stood out. He gestured impatiently at the approaching cars, his body language radiating authority laced with irritation. The SUV rolled to a stop at the officer's signal. The man approached the driver's side window, his boots clicking against the asphalt. David lowered the window slightly, maintaining a polite but cautious demeanor. "License and registration," the officer barked, his tone clipped. David handed over the requested documents without question. "Is there a problem, officer?" The man, whose name tag read Rassett, barely glanced at the papers before shifting his gaze to the back seat. His eyes narrowed as recognition dawned. "Step out of the vehicle," he said curtly, ignoring David's question. Michelle felt a pang of annoyance, but kept her composure. She leaned forward slightly. "Is there an issue, officer? Perhaps I can help clarify." Rassett's gaze snapped to hers, and for a moment there was a flicker of something unspoken in his eyes, resentment, perhaps, or something darker. "Step out of the vehicle," he repeated, this time addressing her directly. "Now." David stiffened. "With all due respect, officer, this is highly irregular. May I ask what this is about?" "It's a routine check," Rassett said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Step out of the car, ma'am, or I'll be forced to take further action." Michelle studied him carefully. His jaw was clenched, his posture rigid. She could sense the undercurrent of hostility in his demeanor, though she couldn't pinpoint its source. Still, she knew better than to escalate the situation. She placed a calming hand on David's shoulder. "It's all right," she said softly. Then, turning to Rassett, she added, "I'll step out, officer, if that's what you need." She opened the door and stepped onto the pavement, her tailored blazer catching the breeze. The murmurs of passers-by reached her ears, and she realized that a small crowd was beginning to form. People recognized her, their phones coming out to capture the unexpected scene. She stood tall, her expression calm but resolute. Rassett motioned for her to move to the side of the car, away from the growing crowd. "What's in the vehicle?" he asked, his voice sharp. "Personal belongings," Michelle replied evenly. "Nothing illegal, if that's your concern." "We'll see about that," Rassett muttered, stepping closer. His towering frame loomed over her, and his eyes seemed to search for any sign of weakness. When he found none, his irritation deepened. "Where are you coming from?" "A meeting," she answered. "Is there a reason you're asking me these questions?" He ignored her inquiry. "And where are you headed?" "Home," she said simply. "Officer, I'm more than willing to cooperate, but I'd appreciate it if you could explain the purpose of this stop." Instead of answering, Rassett took a step back and crossed his arms. His eyes scanned the crowd, which had grown larger. The murmurs grew louder, a mix of curiosity and concern. Someone called out, "Hey, leave her alone. That's Michelle Obama." Rassett's lips tightened. The attention was clearly making him uneasy, but instead of de-escalating, he doubled down. "Ma'am," he said, his tone colder now, "you'll have to wait here while I conduct a more thorough search. Stay where you are." Michelle glanced at David, who looked ready to intervene, and gave him a subtle shake of her head. She knew this wasn't about protocol or security. It was personal. For some reason, this officer had decided to make an example of her. As the minutes dragged on, the tension in the air grew palpable. Michelle remained composed, but the growing crowd and the officer's aggressive demeanor made it clear that this situation was far from ordinary. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the scene as Michelle stood by the side of the SUV, her posture calm yet commanding. Despite the rising tension, she maintained an air of dignity, refusing to let the officer's hostility rattle her. Around her, the crowd grew larger, with whispers rippling through the onlookers as they realized the identity of the woman at the center of the unfolding drama. Officer Rassett, meanwhile, paced with visible irritation. His movements were abrupt, his commands sharp as he gestured for Michelle to stay put. There was something unsettling about his demeanor, a mix of frustration and barely concealed anger. His face, ruddy from the heat and his own mounting emotions, betrayed his struggle to maintain control of the situation. "Step further back," he barked, pointing to a spot near the curb. Michelle complied without a word, though her eyes remained fixed on him. She had dealt with hostility before, but something about this interaction felt different. It wasn't just about authority. It was personal. Rassett seemed determined to assert his power, and she could sense his resentment simmering just beneath the surface. "Is there something specific you're looking for, officer?" she asked evenly, her voice steady despite the undercurrent of tension. Rassett turned sharply, his gaze narrowing. "I'm the one asking questions here," he snapped. "You'll speak when spoken to." The tone of his voice caused a ripple of discomfort among the onlookers. A man in the crowd shouted, "Hey, show some respect!" Others murmured in agreement, their frustration growing evident. Phones were raised higher, recording every moment of the confrontation. Rassett's jaw tightened. The attention was clearly getting to him, but instead of diffusing the situation, he seemed to feed off the pressure. He turned back to Michelle, his stance aggressive. "Where exactly were you before you got here?" he demanded, his voice louder now, as if to reassert his authority over the growing audience. Michelle took a slow breath before answering. As I said earlier, I was at a meeting for a charitable initiative. My schedule is public, officer, so you're welcome to verify that information. Her calm, measured response only seemed to inflame him further. And where's your proof of that? He asked, stepping closer. The move felt unnecessarily confrontational, and Michelle couldn't help but notice how his hand lingered near his holstered weapon. David, still seated in the driver's seat, leaned out of the window, his voice steady but firm. Officer, this has gone far enough. Mrs. Obama has cooperated fully. Is there a valid reason for this continued questioning? Rassett shot him a glare. Stay in the car, he barked. You're not part of this conversation. The tension in the air was palpable. Michelle could feel the weight of the crowd's stares, the hum of whispered conversations blending with the occasional shout of protest. It was clear that the bystanders were becoming increasingly agitated. A woman near the front of the crowd called out, "This is harassment. She hasn't done anything wrong." Rassett ignored the voices, his focus fixed on Michelle. He took another step toward her, his expression hard. "Do you think you're above the law because of who you are?" he sneered, his voice low but laced with venom. The question hung in the air, heavy and accusatory. Michelle met his gaze, her eyes steady and unwavering. "No one is above the law, officer," she replied calmly. "But the law applies to everyone equally, doesn't it?" The statement struck a nerve. Rassett's face darkened, and for a moment his composure cracked. "Don't lecture me," he spat. "You don't know anything about what it's like to work on these streets." "I may not," Michelle admitted, her voice softening slightly. "But I do know that respect and fairness are fundamental to the work you do. I respect your role, officer, but this—" She gestured subtly to the scene around them. "This isn't about the law, is it?" Her words, spoken with quiet authority, seemed to land like a blow. The crowd murmured in agreement, their support emboldening her, but instead of backing down, Rassett's anger boiled over. Without warning, he stepped even closer, his voice rising. "You think you can stand there and lecture me in front of all these people?" he shouted, his hand now gesturing wildly toward the crowd. "Do you think you're better than me?" Before Michelle could respond, the unthinkable happened. In a moment of unchecked rage, Rassett raised his hand and struck her across the face, a sharp, stinging slap that echoed in the stunned silence that followed. The world seemed to stop. The crowd gasped in unison, their collective shock palpable. Michelle stumbled slightly from the force of the blow, but quickly regained her footing. Her hand instinctively went to her cheek, where the sting of the slap lingered. For a moment, her composure faltered, and the hurt in her eyes was visible to all. But then, just as quickly, she straightened her back and lifted her chin. Her gaze locked with Rassett's, and the strength in her eyes returned. She didn't say a word, but the look she gave him was more powerful than anything she could have spoken. The silence was broken by an eruption of anger from the crowd. "Arrest him!" someone shouted. "You can't do that!" another voice cried. The onlookers surged forward slightly, their outrage turning into a palpable force. Rassett stepped back, suddenly aware of what he had done. His face betrayed a flicker of fear as he realized the gravity of his actions. His hand trembled slightly, and he seemed unsure of what to do next. Meanwhile, Michelle remained still, her presence commanding even in the aftermath of the assault. The cameras of dozens of phones were trained on her, capturing every second of the moment. David finally stepped out of the car, his face a mask of controlled fury as he moved to her side. "Are you all right, ma'am?" he asked quietly, his concern evident. Michelle nodded, though her voice was steady as she replied, "I'm fine, David. Thank you." She turned her attention back to Rassett, who now stood frozen, his confidence shattered. The tension in the air was electric, the crowd ready to act. And yet, Michelle remained composed, her calm demeanor serving as a stark contrast to the chaos around her. It was a moment that demanded resolution, but what would come next was far from certain. The roar of the crowd grew louder, their anger swelling like a tidal wave as they bore witness to the unthinkable. Phones recorded every angle of the moment, capturing not just the slap but the aftermath, the stunned silence, Michelle's unwavering composure, and Officer Rassett's faltering confidence. The weight of his actions was beginning to sink in, visible in the slight tremor of his hand and the way his gaze darted nervously toward the onlookers. Michelle remained still, a commanding figure of grace amidst the chaos. Her cheek burned from the strike, but she refused to touch it again. She stood tall, her presence a stark reminder of who she was and the values she embodied. David moved closer to her, his protective instincts on high alert, but she subtly signaled for him to stand down. This was not the moment for retaliation or escalation. Just as the tension seemed poised to reach a breaking point, a convoy of black SUVs appeared at the edge of the intersection. Their arrival was unmissable, the low hum of engines slicing through the noise. Heads turned, and a ripple of recognition swept through the crowd. The unmistakable sight of Barack Obama's motorcade brought a sense of both relief and anticipation. The lead SUV stopped just short of the barricade, and within seconds, the door opened. Barack Obama stepped out, his tall, commanding figure instantly drawing the crowd's attention. Dressed in a crisp navy suit and an open-collared white shirt, he exuded his signature calm authority. His expression was unreadable, but there was a fire in his eyes that hadn't been there moments before. He had seen the growing commotion from his vehicle and had been briefed by his security team on what had transpired. The crowd parted slightly as Barack approached, the air charged with expectation. The presence of the former president seemed to change the dynamic entirely. Conversations hushed, and even the angriest onlookers paused to take in the gravity of the moment. Michelle turned her head as he drew near, their eyes meeting in a brief but meaningful exchange. She didn't need to say anything. He already understood. His gaze shifted to Officer Rassett, who stood frozen, visibly shaken now that he was face to face with Barack Obama. "Good evening, officer," Barack began, his voice steady but firm. "Can you explain what's happening here?" Rassett hesitated, his jaw tightening as he struggled to regain his composure. "It's a routine checkpoint, sir," he replied, his tone lacking the confidence it had carried earlier. "We stopped the vehicle for a standard inspection." Barack raised an eyebrow, his calm demeanor unwavering. "Routine checkpoints usually don't involve striking unarmed citizens, do they?" His words were measured, but there was a sharp edge to them cutting through Rassett's weak attempt at justification. The officer opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. His gaze flickered to the crowd, the cameras, the phones, all of them capturing every detail of this exchange. He looked like a man trapped, fully aware that he was now the center of a storm he had created. Barack took a step closer, his presence both commanding and unyielding. "I'm asking you a simple question, officer," he said. "What justification do you have for laying a hand on my wife?" The crowd murmured in agreement, their voices rising again. "Answer him," someone shouted. "Arrest him," another voice added. The pressure was mounting, and Rassett's inability to respond only fueled their anger. At that moment, another police vehicle pulled up to the scene. Two senior officers stepped out, their expressions grim as they assessed the situation. One of them, a tall man with graying hair and a badge that identified him as Captain Reynolds, quickly approached. His eyes darted between Michelle, Barack, and Rassett, piecing together the events even before anyone spoke. "Mr. President," Captain Reynolds said, addressing Barack with the respect his position demanded, even though Barack no longer held office. "We were called to address a disturbance. It seems there's been an incident." Barack turned to face him, his expression unreadable. "An incident is one way to put it, Captain. Your officer here has just assaulted my wife in front of dozens of witnesses. I assume you'll be taking appropriate action." Reynolds stiffened, his jaw tightening as he glanced at Rassett. The junior officer looked down, avoiding his superior's gaze. "Officer Rassett," Reynolds began, his voice low and deliberate, "is this true?" Rassett opened his mouth, but his words came out in a stammer. It was a misunderstanding. She wasn't cooperating, and I—" "Enough," Reynolds interrupted, his tone sharp. He turned to the other officer who had arrived with him. "Detain him." The order was clear, and within moments, the second officer stepped forward, placing handcuffs on Rassett. The crowd erupted into cheers and applause as they watched the disgraced officer being led away. Some shouted words of encouragement to Michelle, while others continued recording, their phones capturing every angle of the moment. Michelle remained silent, her expression calm but resolute. She exchanged a glance with Barack, and he stepped to her side, placing a supportive hand on her shoulder. "Are you all right?" he asked softly, his voice meant only for her. She nodded. "I'm fine," she replied. "Let's just get out of here." Captain Reynolds stepped forward, addressing them both. "Mr. President, Mrs. Obama, I deeply apologize for this incident. I assure you it does not reflect the values of our department. We will handle this internally." Barack studied him for a moment before nodding. "See that you do," he said. Then, with a glance at the crowd, he added, "And make sure the people here see accountability in action. They need to know that justice applies to everyone." Reynolds nodded solemnly, then stepped back to direct his officers in dispersing the crowd. As Barack and Michelle walked back to their SUV, the crowd parted to let them through. Cheers and words of support followed them, but they didn't stop to acknowledge them. Michelle climbed into the car first, and Barack followed, closing the door behind him. Inside the SUV, a silence settled over them. David glanced at them in the rearview mirror, his concern evident. "Where to now, sir?" he asked. Barack looked at Michelle, his expression softening. "Home," she said quietly. "We've had enough excitement for one day." The SUV pulled away from the scene, leaving the chaos behind. But neither of them could shake the weight of what had just happened. The events of the day would stay with them, but they both knew this was far from over. As the SUV pulled away from the intersection, leaving behind the crowd and the chaos, a heavy silence filled the car. Michelle sat upright, her hands resting on her lap, her gaze fixed on the window. The rhythmic hum of the engine and the faint sounds of the city outside provided a strange contrast to the tension that lingered in the air. Barack watched her for a moment before breaking the silence. "Are you sure you're all right?" he asked softly. Michelle turned her head toward him, her expression calm but resolute. "I'm fine," she said firmly, "but what happened out there, it's not something we can ignore." Barack nodded. He had expected no less from her. "We won't," he assured her. I'll make some calls when we get home." David, the driver, glanced at them in the rearview mirror, his voice laced with concern. "Sir, ma'am, that officer, he needs to be held accountable. What he did was completely out of line." "He will be," Barack said, his voice steady. "But it's not just about him. It's about a system that allows someone like him to feel emboldened enough to act like that." Michelle leaned back in her seat, her mind racing. She thought about the people who had gathered at the intersection, their faces etched with anger and disbelief. She thought about the cameras, the phones raised to capture every moment. This incident would undoubtedly become public knowledge, and she knew the narrative could go in any direction. As they approached their home, Michelle's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and saw a flood of notifications, texts, calls, emails. It had already started. She put the phone down without responding, her focus elsewhere. When they arrived, the quiet of their residence was a stark contrast to the chaos they had just left. They entered the house, and Michelle immediately went to the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of water. Barack followed her, leaning against the counter as he watched her silently. She turned to him, her voice steady but firm. "We need to address this head on. Not just for me, but for everyone who's ever been in a situation like that and didn't have a crowd or a camera to back them up." Barack nodded. "I agree. But first, we need to ensure that the immediate actions are taken. I'll speak to the department. They need to know that this isn't going away quietly." Meanwhile, at the police station, Officer Rassett was escorted into a holding room. His face was pale, his earlier bravado completely gone. Captain Reynolds entered the room a few minutes later, his expression stern. "Do you realize what you've done?" Reynolds demanded, slamming a file onto the table in front of Rassett. "You assaulted a former First Lady, in public, with dozens of witnesses and cameras recording every second." Rassett shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hands fidgeting. "It wasn't intentional," he muttered. "She was being difficult." "Difficult," Reynolds interrupted, his voice rising. "That's your excuse? Do you understand the magnitude of this situation? Your actions don't just reflect on you, they reflect on this entire department." Rassett looked down, his shoulders slumping. He knew there was no way out of this. The evidence was overwhelming, and his own actions had left him without a defense. Reynolds took a deep breath, forcing himself to regain his composure. "Effective immediately. You're suspended without pay, pending a full investigation. And, believe me, there will be an investigation." Outside the station, reporters had already gathered, their cameras trained on the entrance. News of the incident had spread like wildfire, and the public demanded answers. The department released a brief statement acknowledging the incident and confirming that disciplinary actions were underway. Back at the Obamas' home, Barack was on a call with Captain Reynolds. The conversation was direct and professional, but the weight of the situation was clear. "I appreciate your swift action, Captain," Barack said, "but I want to make it clear that this can't be handled behind closed doors. People saw what happened. They need to see accountability." "I understand, Mr. President," Reynolds replied. "We're taking this very seriously. Officer Rassett is already in custody, and we've launched an internal review. You have my word that this will be handled properly." After the call ended, Barack joined Michelle in the living room. She was seated on the couch, her phone in her hand as she scrolled through the flood of messages and headlines. She looked up as he approached, her expression thoughtful. "They've arrested him," Barack said, sitting beside her. The captain assured me that the investigation is already underway. Michelle nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. This isn't just about him, Barack, she said quietly. This is about a culture that allows people like him to act with impunity. We need to shine a light on that, not just this one incident. Barack placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice gentle but resolute. And we will. But tonight, let's take a moment. You've been through a lot today. She sighed, leaning into him slightly. We both have. The next morning, news outlets were flooded with coverage of the incident. Footage from the scene had gone viral, sparking outrage and conversations across the nation. Social media was ablaze with discussions about police accountability, systemic issues, and the role of public figures in addressing these problems. Michelle and Barack watched the coverage together, their expressions a mix of frustration and determination. They knew this was only the beginning of a larger battle, one that they were both prepared to fight. The following days unfolded in a blur of media attention, public outcry, and private reflection. The footage of Officer Rassett's assault on Michelle had become a flashpoint, sparking a nationwide conversation about police accountability, systemic bias, and the abuse of power. The Obamas, accustomed to being in the public eye, found themselves at the center of this firestorm. However, they were determined to use the moment as a platform to drive meaningful change. Michelle sat in the spacious living room of their home, her laptop open on the coffee table in front of her. Around her, papers and notebooks were scattered, filled with ideas and plans. The air was quiet except for the occasional sound of birds outside the window, but her mind was anything but still. She had spent hours reading reports, watching videos of similar incidents, and gathering data on the broader issues plaguing the justice system. Barack entered the room, a mug of coffee in hand. He paused in the doorway, watching her. She was fully immersed in her work, her brow furrowed in concentration. He could see the weight of the moment in her posture, the quiet determination that had always been one of her defining traits. "Making progress?" he asked, his voice soft but supportive. Michelle looked up, her expression thoughtful. "Some," she admitted. "There's so much to unpack here, Barack. What happened to me isn't unique. That's the most infuriating part. This is systemic. It's ingrained." He nodded, setting his coffee down on the table and taking a seat beside her. "And that's exactly why we need to act," he said. "This can't just be about what happened at that intersection. It has to be bigger than that." She leaned back, letting out a slow breath. "I've been thinking about what we can do. Not just statements or appearances, real action. We need to create something tangible, something that can have a lasting impact." Barack leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "What are you thinking?" "A fund," she said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke, "for people who've been affected by police misconduct, for families who've lost loved ones, for individuals who've been unjustly targeted, for communities that are suffering because of systemic failures. We can't change what's already happened, but we can provide support and resources to help people rebuild." Barack considered her words, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "That's a good idea," he said. "No, it's a great idea, and if anyone can make it happen, it's you." Michelle allowed herself a small smile in return. "It's going to take a lot of work," she said. "We'll need partners, funding, a clear plan for how the money will be distributed. But I think we can do it." Barack nodded. "We can, and we will. Let's start making calls." The rest of the day was a flurry of activity. Michelle and Barack reached out to their network of allies, including nonprofit leaders, community organizers, and legal experts. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Many expressed their outrage at what had happened and their eagerness to contribute to a solution. By the evening, the framework for the fund was beginning to take shape. They decided to call it the Justice and Support Fund, emphasizing its dual focus on addressing systemic issues and providing direct assistance to those in need. The initial goals included raising money for legal fees, counseling services, and community development projects. As the days turned into weeks, the fund gained momentum. Donations poured in from individuals and organizations alike, many of whom cited Michelle's resilience and grace in the face of injustice as their inspiration. Public figures and celebrities lent their support, using their platforms to amplify the message. Michelle and Barack hosted a virtual town hall to formally launch the fund, inviting activists, experts, and affected individuals to share their stories and discuss solutions. The event was streamed live, drawing millions of viewers. Michelle spoke with her characteristic eloquence and passion, addressing both the immediate need for accountability and the long-term work required to dismantle systemic bias. "This isn't just about what happened to me," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "This is about what happens every day in communities across this country. It's about the lives that are disrupted, the families that are torn apart, and the futures that are stolen because of injustice. We can't fix the past, but we can fight for a better future. And that's what this fund is about." Her words resonated deeply, sparking a wave of donations and commitments to action. People across the country began organizing their own initiatives, inspired by the fund and its mission. Meanwhile, the case against Officer Rassid continued to unfold. The evidence against him was damning, and public pressure ensured that the investigation remained transparent. Michelle and Barack chose not to involve themselves directly in the proceedings, trusting the legal process to hold him accountable. Instead, they focused their energy on the fund and its growing impact. One of the most meaningful moments came when Michelle visited a community center in a neighborhood deeply affected by police violence. The center had received a grant from the Justice and Support Fund to expand its programs, including legal aid clinics and youth mentorship initiatives. Michelle met with residents, listening to their stories and witnessing firsthand the difference the fund was making. A young woman approached her, her eyes brimming with tears. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "Because of this fund, my brother's case is finally being heard. We've been fighting for justice for so long, and now we have hope." Michelle took her hand, her own eyes misting. "That's what this is all about," she said. "Hope and justice. We're not there yet, but we're going to keep fighting." As she left the center, Michelle felt a renewed sense of purpose. The pain and humiliation of that day at the intersection had been real, but it had also been a catalyst for something bigger. It had sparked a movement, one that was already changing lives. Back at home that evening, she and Barack sat on the porch, watching the sunset over their backyard. The air was warm, and the sky was painted with hues of orange and pink. For a moment, they allowed themselves to simply be present, to take in the quiet beauty of the world around them. "We've come a long way," Michelle said softly. Barack reached for her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "And we've got a long way to go," he replied, "but we're on the right path." Michelle nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "One step at a time," she said, "and we'll keep moving forward." The early morning light filtered through the tall windows of the Obama residence, casting long, golden rays across the hardwood floor. The atmosphere in the house was calm, but beneath that calmness lay the steady hum of purpose. The Justice and Support Fund had gained significant traction over the past weeks, and Michelle and Barack were preparing for a critical day, one that would mark the next milestone in their fight for justice and equality. Michelle sat at the dining table, reviewing the final agenda for a press conference scheduled later that morning. The event was set to highlight the progress of the fund, announce new partnerships, and deliver a message of hope and resilience. Across from her, Barack was on the phone, speaking with one of their key partners, ensuring that every detail of the day was perfectly aligned. As he ended the call, he leaned back in his chair and looked at Michelle. "You ready for this?" he asked, his tone light but his expression serious. She smiled faintly. "I've been ready," she said. "Today isn't just about what we've accomplished, it's about what comes next." The press conference was held at the historic Howard Theater, a venue rich with cultural significance. Its grand stage had hosted countless luminaries, and today it would serve as the backdrop for a moment that was about more than just the Obamas. It was about a movement that had taken root and was beginning to blossom. The theater was filled with a diverse audience, from community leaders and activists to everyday citizens whose lives had been touched by the fund. The buzz of conversation filled the air as people took their seats, their anticipation palpable. On the stage, a podium stood in the center, flanked by banners bearing the logo of the Justice and Support Fund, a symbol of unity and resilience. When Michelle and Barack stepped onto the stage, the audience erupted into applause. Michelle stood tall, her presence commanding yet approachable, as she approached the podium. She waited for the applause to subside before speaking, her voice steady and clear. "Good morning," she began, her gaze sweeping across the audience. "Thank you for being here today. Thank you for your support, your passion, and your belief that together we can build a more just and equitable future." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "A few weeks ago, I stood at a crossroads, not just a literal one, but a metaphorical one as well. That moment was difficult, but it was also clarifying. It reminded me of why we must continue to fight for fairness and dignity for every individual, no matter their background, their race, or their circumstances." The audience listened intently as she spoke, her words resonating deeply. She went on to outline the progress of the fund, sharing stories of those it had already helped, families who had received legal aid, communities that had benefited from new resources, and individuals who had found hope in the face of adversity. "These stories are not just about injustice," she said. "They are about resilience, about the human spirit, and about the power of community. They remind us that while we cannot change the past, we can shape the future. And that is what this fund is about." She turned to acknowledge the partners and organizations that had joined the effort, expressing gratitude for their collaboration. Then, with a determined glint in her eye, she addressed the broader issue at hand. "But let's be clear," she said, "this fund is a step forward, but it is not the solution. The solution lies in systemic change, in policies, in accountability, and in the way we view and value every human being. It is a fight that requires all of us, and it is a fight we cannot afford to lose." The audience erupted into applause, their energy a testament to the impact of her words. Michelle stepped back, allowing Barack to take the podium. He spoke briefly but powerfully, reinforcing the message of unity and action. After the speeches, they stayed to meet with attendees, listening to their stories and answering their questions. The theater buzzed with activity, a sense of hope and determination filling the air. Michelle felt a renewed sense of purpose as she spoke with individuals whose lives had been touched by the fund. One conversation in particular stayed with her. A young man approached, his hands shaking slightly as he extended a folder toward her. "Mrs. Obama," he said, his voice trembling, "I want to thank you. Because of your fund, I was able to hire a lawyer to fight a case that no one else would take. My life was on the line, and now I have a chance to rebuild it." Michelle took the folder and looked him in the eye. "You're the reason we're doing this," she said warmly, "and your courage is what inspires us to keep going." As the day drew to a close, Michelle and Barack returned home, physically tired but emotionally energized. They sat together in their living room reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. "We've come a long way," Barack said, echoing the sentiment they had shared weeks earlier. "But there's still so much more to do." Michelle nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "And we'll do it," she said. "One step at a time, one life at a time." In the days that followed, the Justice and Support Fund continued to grow, its impact spreading far and wide. The case against Officer Rassett culminated in a trial where he was convicted of misconduct and excessive use of force. His conviction served as a reminder that accountability was possible, but it also highlighted the work that still needed to be done. For Michelle and Barack, the incident at the intersection had been a turning point, a moment of pain that had given rise to purpose. It had reaffirmed their commitment to justice, to equity, and to the belief that even in the face of adversity, change was always possible. And so, they continued forward, fueled by the knowledge that their fight was far from over, but their resolve was stronger than ever. Together, they would keep moving, step by step, toward a better, brighter future. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more content and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to share it with your friends and explore our channel for more stories and insights. See you in the next one.